kind of turn the political volume down and to explore with some of the smartest people on the planet sort of their thoughts around how we can impact our policy and our democracy. So I couldn't be more excited for conversation today with really one of the incredible corporate visionaries, CEOs, and philanthropists in our country. Just a little bit about USAFacts. It is I love this because it's very consistent with how we view our brand. It is a nonpartisan civic initiative aimed at making government numbers more available and understandable to Americans. In short, how do we take the data that already exists in the government and make it more accessible? And what will the impact of that, having that data more accessible be on our policy? Today we're going to learn about Steve's incredible journey prior to founding USAFacts, why he came to believe and gain greater insight into our government by understanding the data that it possesses is so important to our democracy and to our policy. Obviously, Steve is not only the founder of USAFacts, but also a co-founder of the Ballmer Group, which supports efforts to improve economic mobility for children and families, especially those likely to remain in poverty. He owns, as I'm sure many of you know, the Los Angeles Clippers. I may have a question or two for him about that. And of course, the CEO of Microsoft for 14 years. I like to point out he does have a little bit of a background in journalism. He was the advertising manager at the Harvard Crimson. So I think he probably has an understanding of what it feels like to be the CEO of Politico. So we have that in common. So without further delay, we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So please think about what you want those questions to be. I think this is going to be a pretty fast-moving process. But we want to save at least 15 minutes for questions. So please join me in giving a Steve Ballmer welcome to the stage, and thank you to USAFacts for supporting us and making this event possible. So I'm going to go right to the heart of the matter. By the way, we both, we're going to get to this, but we both brought our annual report and 10K to the stage. Hopefully you guys will get copies of that. But I want to start, and I think a lot of the people in the audience share this sort of question that I have. Just asking you about sort of your thoughts around data and why data is so important to our democracy. You spent 34 years at Microsoft. Really tackling incredibly complex issues and actually making information and products more accessible to vast swaths of our economy. So now that you've retired from Microsoft, you obviously can do virtually anything that you want in the world. Why is it that you've spent your time focused now on data and the accessibility of government data?
Yeah, about probably I retired 4 years ago from Microsoft, and pretty early on I started talking to my wife about our philanthropic activities. And one of the things that I believed early on, and then I didn't believe, and I've kind of come full circle, is in a sense the number one funder of everything related to economic mobility is the government. There's just not enough philanthropic dollars to fill in big holes. If you really want to help subsidize, take early childhood education, there's no way for philanthropy to do that. There's just not enough money. So the question is, how does philanthropy dovetail with what the government's doing? Is philanthropy's role to pioneer new things, run big tests, fill the holes that government won't fill? Well, in order to understand any of that, the first thing you have to understand is, where does the government money go, and what kind of outcomes is it achieving today? And if you want to use money wisely, you have to say, how does the money then help leverage, or the philanthropic money drive better outcomes? And then it gets you to, what's the living standard for children, how does that get funded, where does the money come from, how much money is really moving for more affluent people to support younger people, how much of that just supports lifestyle, which is poverty improvement versus economic mobility. And at the end of the day, if you want to be outcomes based, you have to say, where does the money come from, what does it get spent on, and what kind of outcomes? Well, I went hunting and didn't find much, as they say. Actually, that's probably not true. I found a lot, almost too much. And it was 2K, and I'm really good with numbers. I'll sort of cop to that up front. I went to a summer math camp, which is my way of saying geek, and it was almost too much. There was no ability to see the forest for the trees when it came to government numbers. I also figured this out along the way. You can't look at the federal government, which is what's in the news all the time. You can't look at the federal government independent of the states. How are kids in need handled? Well, Medicaid is a big part of that, for example. And there's a lot of buzz about what goes on with Medicaid at the federal level. And yet what the states choose to do is every bit as important. So if you want to look at the impact, you have to look at the joint impact. Woo! Then you go looking for those numbers. And pretty soon you say, it's too much. And then, so I said, okay, I need to understand this at a higher level. If it was a business as a former CEO or a former banker, what do you go looking for? You go looking for the 10K. There should be a goodies bag for all of you with a printed version, although it's in its interactive form has a lot more information. But you go looking for something. Why a 10K? 10Ks have to be objective. I mean, like you signed your life away as a CEO that you didn't exaggerate anything, you didn't make anything up. If you write the thing in a style that is too exaggerated, the SEC cuts you down. It's historical. You don't make forecasts except for pension liabilities. And so you take a look at all that, and that's how I got started. I thought it might be of more general interest, and I used the 10K metaphor because it was so objective. You could say dry, but at least it's not political. You're not just picking up numbers out of context and throwing them together. You have to show the whole picture.
So, you mentioned I spent 16 years in corporate finance before I came here, and I've read a lot of 10Ks and Qs in my life. I was up late last night. I don't have Ron Jackson as my doctor, reading through the 10K. I went to the risk factors, which to me is sort of one of those areas where you can really identify objectively what the risks in the business. But for those of you, after the great crash in 1929, the SEC basically said that public companies, if you're going to sell stocks or bonds, you have to produce a document, a disclosure document, and there can be no BS in that document. And they really hold you to it. And so it is. I think it's interesting that as a CEO, right, you were a public CEO for 15 years. You put out lots of your own Ks and Qs. You felt like that this was the right medium to communicate with the audience, and you say, and you read through your annual report, right? You're not prescribing policy recommendations. You just believe that the American public will be better able to make their own decisions based on having the facts. And you call the organization USAFacts. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't unfortunately think we're going to get as broad readership for this document as I think would behoove us. On the other hand, what it did is it gave us the discipline and rigor and objectivity and comprehensiveness that is required by the SEC. We produced this, and then we did the next thing that a company does, which is to try to make it simpler. And so we created an annual report. It's got pictures, it's got the same information, but it's summarized. The thing that is nice in the corporate setting and here is we have picked certain things to present, but if you think there's something else that you need to know, we let you get at it. We only use government numbers. Why? Because our government is responsible for its own numbers. How much tax revenue came in, how much went out. It would be naive to think economists estimate that. Let's use the numbers. The government collects statistics on Medicaid enrollees or the number of violent crimes in the year. There's no better source for that data. And if our government's not doing it responsibly, we all should be holding the government accountable for that.
And you in the annual report, you use a framework of straight out of the United States Constitution, right? You divide sort of our government into 4 different segments. Talk to me about those segments. It feels like business segments, so maybe your perspective as a CEO is helpful, but maybe start with the Constitution and sort of why you pick those 4 segments.
Yeah. Is the mission of government to make a profit? No. So you can throw that out at the start. Some people will tell you that there better be a constraint that you don't lose a ton of money, but you don't come together to make a profit. So you have to say, we want to understand these entities, because we roll up state, federal, and local government, by the mission. So at first I wrote down, okay, like a business would, these are our lines of business. We do A, and we do B, and we do C. And I thought it was just as complicated and confusing as all the numbers we saw. And then one of our folks said, I know what the mission of government is. I said, oh, tell us about that. He said, look at this thing called the Constitution. Pretty good place to start in the U.S., despite the fact that some people say it's an antique, it still drives us. And there in the preamble to the Constitution, it says, government is supposed to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, interestingly, not to conduct war, but to provide for the common defense, which is what we really talk about in the report, to promote the general welfare, and then secure these blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And we say, okay, that is a structure. It's like GE saying we've got an engines business, a jet engines business, and a electric power plant business. It's an organizing structure. Because one of the problems I had is, how do you look at all these fragmented little pieces? And then businesses divide those one more level to something called reporting units, because there's a bunch of SEC regulations about things that are one level below, and then we just took each of those missions and subdivide it. So if you look at justice and domestic tranquility, there's obviously physical safety from other people, call that what we think of as criminal justice. We also said there's disasters. How do we help people with their physical safety in terms of natural disasters? There's people's commercial safety. Employers taking advantage of employees, people taking advantage of one another financially, for example, over the internet. And then there's a special topic around child safety. Well, that seems to be pretty much everything we need to keep safe. Next! And you can go, one by one and walk through these things.
So we'll dig into a couple of these a little bit more detail. But obviously, as you approach this problem, started the organization 3 years ago, you put your first annual report out last year. This is the one you just released this week as your second annual report. You obviously looked around and realized there's massive amounts of data, but did not feel like there was any sort of central repository where you could A, find it, and B, make sense of it. Is that?
That's exactly right. And we have a website you can navigate. So we let you have a few different windows. You can come to the website. We have a Twitter feed. I don't love the fact we have a Twitter feed because I feel like a politician taking numbers out of context, but at least we tell you how to dive in further. But the annual report and the 10K are sort of bedrock because they're done with a certain rigor that we're proud of.
And you have a team of people based out of Seattle, your hometown. They sort of gather this data. What's the process?
Yeah, we have actually a team in Seattle. We have a team at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, your alma mater, as well as a variety of vendors.
Previously, it was I think much less accessible. How does you obviously towards the end of your career at Microsoft, you were starting to push into the cloud, which is sort of the next generation of the democratization of data and allowing millions of Americans to find a place where they can store safely and store their data. How did your experience sort of as a CEO and as an innovator at Microsoft sort of enter into your thinking about the construction of this data? And I guess what I'm getting at is, why do you believe that having more data in accessible places is a good thing for our country?
Yeah, let me break that into probably three pieces. Piece number one, as a product development process, it seems kind of similar to me. You do a version 1, you do a version 2. If you're Microsoft, you get it absolutely right by version 3. We're about version 2 right now. We'll get to version 3. But you have a cadence and a pace. It doesn't mean you're not changing things. In the world of the cloud, we can update these things far more rapidly than we could. We take that as kind of a framework. I think of what we're doing with the team at the University of Pennsylvania at Wharton is really building our platform, our operating system. By collecting all this data and putting it together, we can spin products, but the goal over time will be to let third parties actually write programs that take data out of the database and do analysis so that people don't have to run around and sort of scrounge this data. So even if it's a reporter or a data scientist doing a presentation for Politico, or whether it's an economist who wants to pull the data, we want to bring it, centralize it, organize it, and let people use it. We want to be able to be the back end to search engines, so that when you pose a question to a search engine, you actually get an answer. We want to be a basis for which people can go do curriculum. It turns out it's interesting. When you're in school, you learn a lot about the structure of government. We have 3 branches, separation of powers, that's all important. But if you actually ask a student who graduates, what are the pieces of the government as it operates today, and how big are they, and how much taxes are you likely to pay for it? I don't think you're going to get a very solid answer coming out of most high school government classes. So how would you build curriculum? It's a platform. Second piece is really what I'll call the marketing piece. I don't get involved with products that nobody uses. This is not a vanity project for me. It's a tough one to define an early audience. I learned this at Microsoft though too. You have to build a product often before you find your logical audience. You have somebody in mind, but you tune. We're in what I would call the early adopter phase. I don't want to target only number geeks. On the other hand, we've got to get early adopters, not just academics and policy people. We also want to get, let me call them citizens who like numbers, who will be early adopters. And as we make this stuff more approachable, we can get out to a broader audience. So we have to have that kind of product concept in mind. And then we have to learn to hit people kind of where they live. When is it that people want this information? Is it when they vote? Is it when they file their taxes? And how do we make sure we're present at the right times and in the right places? And then with that in context, what's our goal? Simple. I think it is twofold. Number one, we think citizens ought to have enough perspective to intelligently assess either an issue and then from assessing the issue, boom, they ought to be able to talk to their representatives in Congress and Senate. So that's an important piece to us. I flip it around though and say we also view it as a mission of ours to try to drive better data from government and more use of data by government in its decision-making processes. And that's true at all levels. And not to, some of the things people say just kind of drive me crazy. People pick a number out of thin air, or not out of thin air. They'll pick an accurate number and put no context around it. And I think sort of accountable government to some degree starts with numbers. How many government decisions don't have to be implemented by changes in taxes and spending? How much do citizens feel they understand about the outcomes of spending, let alone how much do politicians understand? I'll give you a set of facts to think about. Our spending on education has gone up dramatically as a country in the last 37 years. Dramatic, I don't like adjectives. Dramatically is in the annual report that we gave you. But the way to think about it is student-teacher ratios have come down. They've come down to about 16-1 from north of 18-1. That's interesting because most people in this audience, I bet if you have kids, you'll say, what? I don't see shrinking class sizes. This doesn't make sense to me. If you look at educational outcomes, as measured, for example, by proficiency in reading and math at the 8th grade level, it's only 33%. Gosh, we're spending all that money and nobody's learning to read at grade level proficiently? And then you see graduation rates going up when reading and math proficiency is flat. You tell me how you feel about the growth in expenditures on education. Everybody will say, oh, education's number one, we have to spend. I tell you, we have to spend on outcomes. We have to drive outcomes, not just drive spending. And what does this all tell you, and what might it tell you in your state election or your school board election locally?
So you do, you're very careful to say in the annual report that this is not a policy prescription. And you just made a great point. You just said, here's the data. We've gone from 19 to 16 in the classroom. We've increased our spending per student by probably double. And yet, 35% of 8th graders are proficient in math when we're graduating. To me, like, it doesn't really add up. And so is the goal to just sort of make pretty broad audience aware of those data points so that, other people jump in to try and figure out how we can improve the process? You know what I mean? By pointing that, is that the goal?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in education. I know that's true and that bugs me. Is the answer we don't pay our teachers enough? Some people think so. Is the answer we pay our teachers too much? Some states are squeezing teacher pay. Is teacher pay really not the big issue here? Is it a mix? Is this just a demographic shift to who's in school? And we have more poor kids as a percentage in school, and they have issues that are outside the classroom that are affecting academic performance. Is that part of it? Eventually, we got to get the data down to the school district level, because I'm sure what we'll see is there are some pockets that don't perform as well. So for me to say, this is the answer, I'm not an expert in education. Nor am I somebody who's supposed to tell you, let's go pay our teachers more, or let's pay our teachers less, or let's increase class size. One of the things I want to get in the report is what's the split between special education students and so-called advanced learners. Is that something that's driving cost? Different people will have different perspectives. If you have a special needs kid, you're going to have a perspective. If you don't have a special needs kid, you might have a different perspective. I'm not going to opine on that.
But your belief is if we can harness the data, if we can sort of present it in an accessible format, that's a starting point for the debate.
Right. And part of what I want to do in our next phase is actually then take the data and frame the issue. Frame the issue, not propose the answer. I will cop to this. This is a policy position. I think we got to balance our budget. I do. That's just, I'm a business person. Sorry, it's just in my blood. We have to do that. But I'll be silent about whether we should do that with spending cuts, increased taxes, some mix. The political will of the American people has to figure that out. I hope. This is policy for me. I hope, and I won't give a lot of policy, but at least people have to understand where the major levers are on both spending and on taxes. People say, well, the states all have balanced budgets. You can see from our report that there's a little speciousness to that, because the federal budget fills in so much things in the states, so we just get the federal government to borrow, run deficits, give the monies to the states, and the states can say, hey, our budget's balanced. So it's not pure to say this is just a federal problem. So what would you do with state taxes, for example? Where do they come from? When people have the discussion about who pays taxes in this country, people do ignore things like sales tax, I'll tell you that. Even payroll tax, people ignore. Would it surprise you if I said the percentage of money that poor people pay in taxes exceeds their income? It's actually the opposite of what sort of the public rhetoric is. Why is that true? Because people don't include sales tax, payroll tax, etc.
So for the people in the audience that have gone through the report, again, I did last night. I really went through the campaign. I clicked on it. I found some fascinating information that I never sort of fully understood before. A couple of examples for me: 28% of the land in the United States is owned by the federal